Alright, so in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Jezebel. We'll be reconstructing the historical narrative and discovering that Jezebel was a prostitute, Jezebel was not the wife of Ahab, and Ahab was not the king of Israel. I'll be building off of and referencing Paul Davidson's excellent video on Jezebel over at the Inquisitive Bible Reader. If you haven't seen the video, be sure to check it out. I'll link to it in the description, and be sure to subscribe to the Inquisitive Bible Reader. As usual, the key to understanding the biblical narrative of Jezebel is to realize that it was written as propaganda. The biblical author wasn't concerned about historical accuracy, but rather about his political agenda. So we'll be attempting to take the biblical narrative and separating out the historical narrative from the propaganda. We can do this by identifying glitches, ambiguities, and propaganda techniques in the text. So to understand Jezebel, we first have to take a look at Ahab and who Ahab was. The first propaganda technique we'll be looking at is what I call the redundant lie. This is where the biblical author repeats things unnecessarily in order to change something in the narrative. Redundant lie number 1 is that Ahab was the son of Omri. The biblical author tells us this 4 times, which is not a lot of times, but it does tell us that in 3 consecutive sentences. This is a propaganda technique I refer to as genetic splicing, and we see it a lot with kings, as biblical authors attempt to validate kingly lines by injecting them into previous kingly lines. In past posts and videos, I've talked about how David was not the son of Jesse, Jonathan was not the son of Saul, and Solomon was not the son of David. So the possibility of Ahab not being the son of Omri is not that surprising. We may actually have some extra biblical evidence for this. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III mentions the son of Omri, but it's not Ahab that's mentioned, it's Jehu. Which is interesting because Jehu is not a son of Omri at all, not even a descendant. Many think the obelisk misidentifies the son of Omri here. But if the Bible is propaganda, then the black obelisk may be a more objective record of who the son of Omri actually was. Redundant lie number 2, Ahab was a king of Israel, and Ahab was a king. We're told this 49 times in the narrative. And you might be saying, well, of course he's called king. He was a king. It's natural to reference him as such. But that's typically not how kings are referenced. They're usually referenced by name. Even in the same narrative, the kings of Judah are normally referenced by name and not by title. This is because it's using a propaganda technique that I refer to as the generic juke. So this is when the biblical author uses a title instead of a name in order to associate that person with the title. We see this especially in 1 Kings 20 and 22 when the biblical author uses the king instead of Ahab. The Inquisitive Bible Reader points out that the sequence of 20 and 22 are rearranged in the Greek version of the Bible, and this may be one indication that chapters 20 and 22 were written by a different author than chapters 21. However, all of those chapters are trying to convince the reader that Ahab is a king. So they may be written by different authors, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were written around the same time since they contain the same propaganda. Trying to convince the reader that Ahab was a king shows up in another propaganda technique that I refer to as a plausible ignorance. One variation of this technique is the secret. Oh, you didn't know that Saul was anointed king? That's because it was done in secret. And even in the Ahab narrative, we see that Jehu was also anointed king in secret. This is done in order to hide the fact that they actually weren't anointed kings. Another variation of this technique is called the disguise. We see this when Ahab talks to Jehoshaphat before going to battle, talking about how Ahab will disguise himself, but Jehoshaphat can dress like a king. So when the original reader said, hey, I don't remember another king being in that battle, the biblical author responds by saying, oh, well, he was there, he was just disguised as a regular soldier. Redundant lie number 3 is that Ahab lived in Samaria. We're told this 10 times in the narrative. Examples of this are in 1 Kings 20:43, where it says, resentful and upset, the king of Israel went home to Samaria. And in 1 Kings 21:18a, it says, go, meet King Ahab of Israel, who lives in Samaria. One of the more interesting instances of this is in 1 Kings 22:36-37, where after the battle was lost, the call goes out, every man to his own city. And of course, where does Ahab go? But he's brought to Samaria. The biblical author not only has to relocate Ahab to Samaria, he also has to relocate his descendants. The original reader would have said, hey, I don't remember any of Ahab's descendants being in Samaria. The biblical author responds with a propaganda technique that I call a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, Ahab's descendants were in Samaria, you just didn't realize it because they were raised by other men. as we're told in 2 Kings 10, 6-7. So if Ahab didn't live in Samaria, where did he live? Well, we have to ask two other questions in order to answer that question. The first being what other locations are mentioned in the narrative, and the second is which of those locations are closely associated with Ahab. The best candidate to fulfill those questions is Jezreel. At this point, some of you may be saying, hold on, we have extra biblical evidence that Ahab was king of Israel, and that evidence is contained in the Kirk Stele and the Misha Stele. But the Misha Stele simply refers to the son of Omri, and even the biblical narrative names Omri's grandson in the account and not Ahab. The Kirk Stele does say Ahab of Israel, although there is some controversy about this translation. At least one scholar interprets it as Ahab of Jezreel, which fits in nicely with what I'm proposing here. Although the consensus is that it should be translated as Ahab of Israel, that consensus seems to be based on the biblical account. But if the biblical account is propaganda, then that consensus may be wrong. Also, it never actually refers to Ahab as a king. It simply uses the phrase, these 12 kings. The problem is that there's only 11 kings. So many scholars believe that this is simply a phrase that refers to a type of alliance, and doesn't necessarily refer to 12 kings. Regardless, Ahab probably was an Israelite. I don't really have an issue with that. I'm simply saying that Ahab wasn't the king of Israel, and probably wasn't even a king. Although I'm open to the possibility that he became a king, at least in the eyes with those he was allied with. So if Ahab wasn't the king of Israel, who was he? I'm proposing that he was a military leader, and with all the mentions of horses and chariots in the narrative, I'm guessing he was probably a commander of some sort of chariot battalion. As a military leader, I believed he formed an alliance with Aram against Israel. We may have some archaeological evidence in this direction, with Jezreel being a military city, and the building mentioned in the biblical narrative was not a palace, but rather a military installation. If Ahab did form an alliance with the Arameans, the biblical author would have had to put that relationship in a new light. This is what we have in 1 Kings 20. Ahab calls Ben-Hadad his brother. Ben-Hadad's servants are like, yeah, he's your brother, sure. Then Ahab has him come up into his chariot, and they form a treaty. But this treaty is a trade treaty and not a military treaty. Another interesting point is where Ahab is disguised in the battle that I described earlier. The biblical author feels the need to tell us which way Ahab was facing. In 1 Kings 22:35a, it says he was facing the Arameans. Well, if he was an Israelite, of course he would be facing them. But if he had formed an alliance with them, he wouldn't have been facing the Arameans, and the biblical author has to add in this seemingly unnecessary detail. One other possible connection to this alliance is a reference that Ahab sold himself. The biblical author reframes this as selling himself out to idolatry. But in the historical narrative, he would have sold himself out to the Arameans. Alright, so this brings us to Jezebel. Redundant line number 4 is that Jezebel was a princess. Now, this is only mentioned 2 times, but this may have been written by a redactor, which had written much less content, so that gives us a smaller sample size. Regardless, with all the other evidence I'll be pointing to, I hope you'll accept this as a redundant lie. And if I'm right about Ahab not being a king, then it's likely that Jezebel was not a queen or a princess, unless Ahab had some major game. Alright, redundant lie number 5 is Jezebel was Ahab's wife. We are told this 4 times, which isn't a whole lot, but it's enough to qualify as a redundant lie. So if Jezebel wasn't a princess and she wasn't married to Ahab, then who was she? And of course, I'm proposing that Jezebel was a prostitute. Now, if Jezebel was a prostitute in the historical narrative, we're not going to find this explicitly said in the biblical account. But we should find hints of it, and that we do. In 2 Kings 9:22, Jehu refers to Jezebel's acts of prostitution. This fits oddly in the narrative, although the biblical author has changed the context around that phrase and is hoping that readers would read it in light of her idolatry. And in some translations, that's what they do, referring to it as all of the idolatry. In 1 Kings 9:30, Jezebel puts on eyeshadow and fixes her hair before Jehu comes to see her. Perhaps she's going to seduce Jehu when he gets there, but she immediately insults him. thereby also making this description sit oddly in the narrative. There's only two types of people that would do this type of thing. One is a princess and the other is a prostitute. And if we rule out the princess, then that leaves the prostitute. We have one other prostitution reference in the narrative. This is in 1 Kings 22:37-38, where it talks about how Ahab's chariot was washed out at the pool of Samaria where the prostitutes bathed. This, of course, is not a direct reference to Jezebel, but it is another prostitution reference in the narrative. So now we come to Naboth. And redundant lie number 6 is that Naboth was from Jezreel. We're told this 5 times. So if Naboth wasn't from Jezreel, then who was he? Well, we don't have a lot of content about Naboth, so it's kind of hard to say. There may be one propaganda technique that is used with Naboth, and that's what I refer to as hiding in plain sight. A good example of this technique is with Ruth, which you can learn more about in my Ruth video. But in the historical narrative, Ruth was a slave, and so the biblical author has to explain why Ruth is doing slave things when she wasn't a slave. The biblical author simply has Boaz tell her to hang out with his slaves. In the case of Naboth, he may have been a leader of the people. The biblical author reframes this as simply being a plot to kill Naboth. Okay, so all this brings us to the narrative about Naomis Vineyard. This narrative is in 1 Kings 21, 1-19, and we're just going to read through it. Now it came about after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite, redundant lie, had a vineyard. I think there was a conflict over land between Ahab and Naboth, but I don't think it was a vineyard. So I think this is another redundant lie. Which was in Jezreel. So this is interesting. It's placing this in Jezreel, which is kind of contradicting what the biblical author would be trying to do, which is trying to move Ahab to Samaria. And the inquisitive Bible reader points out that the Greek version of this verse actually doesn't have in Jezreel. So I think that in Jezreel is actually a redaction, which I will talk about a little bit later. All right, so continuing. Was in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab, the king of Samaria, redundant lie. And Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, "Give me your vineyard," redundant lie, "so that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is close beside my house, and I will give you a better vineyard," redundant lie. "In place of it, if you prefer, I will give you what it is worth in money." I think this is also a redundant lie. I don't think there was ever a offer of money for this land conflict. But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid me that I would give you the inheritance of my fathers." So this is the first quote of Naboth, and there's going to be 2 other quotes, the same type of line, but they're all slightly different, which I will talk about those in a bit. So Ahab entered his house sullen and furious because of the answer that Naboth the Jezreelite, redundant lie, had given to him, since he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." So again, that's another quote, slightly different from Naboth. And he lay on his bed and turned his face away and ate no food. But Jezebel, his wife, redundant lie, came to him and said to him, "How is it that your spirit is so sullen that you are not eating food?" So he said to her, "It is because I was speaking to Naboth the Jezreelite," redundant lie, and saying to him, "Give me your vineyard," redundant lie, "for money," redundant lie, "or else, if it pleases you, I will give you a vineyard," redundant lie, in place of it. But he said, "I will not give you my vineyard." So this is the third quote of Naboth here. And I think what the biblical author is doing here is using a propaganda technique that I refer to as sanitizing sayings. So in the first quote, the author is injecting Yahweh or the Lord, and it's offering that as a reason why Naboth is not giving Ahab the land. And the third quote refers to it as vineyard, which I think is a redundant lie, so I don't think that was actually the quote either, which leaves the middle quote, which is what I think Naboth actually said, which is, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." So continuing, Jezebel, his wife, redundant lie, said to him, "Do you now reign over Israel?" And this question, this rhetorical question, is a propaganda technique that I refer to as begging the answer. given the context that the biblical author provides, the answer to this rhetorical question of does Ahab reign over Israel is an obvious yes. But since in the historical narrative Ahab was not king of Israel, then this would be answered in the negative. All right, so continuing, arise, eat bread, and let your heart be joyful. I will give you the vineyard, redundant lie, of Naboth the Jezreelite, redundant lie. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. And this is a propaganda technique that I refer to as a plausible misunderstanding. The biblical author has to continually explain to the reader why it's not what it looks like. In this instance, it looks like Ahab wrote the letters. But the biblical author is saying, no, that's not the case. It was really Jezebel. She just wrote the letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. So it just looked like the letters were from Ahab. And this instance was what actually got me really interested in the Jezebel narrative because it seems so obvious, at least to me, that the biblical author is shifting the blame of Naboth's murder from Ahab to Jezebel. All right, continuing. And sent the letters to the elders, the nobles who were living with Naboth in his city. Now she had written in the letters, saying, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the people, hiding Naboth in plain sight. And seat 2 worthless men opposite him, and have them testify against him, saying, you curse God and the king, redundant lie. Then take him out and stone him to death. So the men of his city, the elders and the nobles who lived in his city, did just as Jezebel had sent word to them, just as it was written in the letters which she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth at the head of the people, hiding in plain sight. Then the 2 worthless men came in and sat opposite him, and the worthless men testified against him, against Naboth, before the people, saying, Naboth, curse God and the king, redundant lie. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent word to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. So notice this is the first instance that we're told that he is dead. And when Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, that's the second instance, Jezebel said to Ahab, arise, take possession of the vineyard, redundant lie, of Naboth the Jezreelite, redundant lie, which he refused to give you for money, redundant lie, for Naboth is not alive, but dead. Now that's an interesting redundancy. We're told not only in the positive that he's dead, but we're told in the negative that he's not alive. And we've already been told that he's dead. We've been told twice already that he's dead. And in the next sentence it says, when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead. So again, this redundancy of letting us know that Naboth was dead. So obviously to me, that makes me think that Naboth was not dead when Ahab went to go take possession of the land. Ahab got up to go down to the vineyard, redundant lie, of Naboth the Jezreelite, redundant lie, to take possession of it. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, redundant lie, who is in Samaria, redundant lie. Behold, he is in the vineyard, redundant lie, of Naboth, where he has gone down to take possession of it. And you shall speak to him, saying, this is what the Lord says, have you murdered and also taken possession? Now, this is an interesting question because it looks like the begging the answer propaganda technique. And given the context, the biblical author wants us to answer in the affirmative, at least to the taking possession. But it also says you have murdered. But in the biblical context, Ahab did not murder Naboth, at least not directly. It was Jezebel that murdered Naboth. So I think this may be a Freudian slip here by the biblical author admitting that Ahab was the one that murdered Naboth. All right, and continuing, and you shall speak to him, saying, the Lord says this, in the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, the dogs will lick up your blood, yours as well. And notice the redundancy at the end there. Your blood and yours as well. It's a biblical author emphasizing that it's Ahab's blood, which raises the possibility that in the historical narrative, it wasn't Ahab's blood. So now I want to talk about something the inquisitive Bible reader highlights, and that is after this verse about the dogs licking up the blood, it it mentions this curse of nonberial. And this curse is mentioned 3 times in 1 Kings. And it goes something like, those who die in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the fields, the birds of the air shall eat. The inquisitive Bible reader says that this should be taken figuratively, which I would agree. But then he says that the verse about the dogs licking up the blood is a redactor trying to make the figurative into a literal prediction. But I do not agree with this. And this might surprise some of you because I do talk about a propaganda technique that I call the literal figurative switcheroo. This is often used with sexual euphemisms. You can check out my blog post on Ruth to learn more about that, as well as my podcast episode on Jael and Sisera and their sexual encounters. But I don't think that's what we have here with the verse about the dogs licking up the blood. And I think this comes down to a difference in how we view how the biblical text was constructed. If I understand the inquisitive Bible reader correctly, I think he views the biblical author as trying to combine 2 versions of the same narrative. So there's, he's doing his best to combine these 2 ancient narratives to preserve the traditions of Israel. Whereas I am approaching the text as it's propaganda, and the biblical author is trying to suppress the original narrative. So it's not trying to integrate anything or combine anything. He's manipulating the original narrative and trying to suppress certain aspects of that narrative. So when we come to a biblical text and, the styling is the same, the narrative flow is the same, and then we come to like a sentence that really sticks out and we say, oh, this doesn't go with the rest. It must be a later redaction because it doesn't fit in very well. But with propaganda, that may not be the case because propaganda is subverting the original narrative. And in order to do that, it has to take critical elements from the historical narrative, usually an oral tradition, and it has to put those critical elements into a new context in order to change their meaning, and thereby promote the propaganda, the agenda of the biblical author. But propaganda can't delete critical elements from the narrative. Otherwise, people would recognize it as propaganda, right? Like if you're telling a story and people are already familiar with that story, like that oral tradition, and you just leave out critical parts of it, people are going to be like, that's not how the story goes, right? But if you change it slightly and put it into a new context, then you can trick people basically to think, oh, well, maybe I got the original story wrong, and this is just a fuller understanding of what happened. So these critical elements from the oral tradition, they form this ambidextrous text, right? It's text that fits both into the original oral tradition and the biblical text. But sometimes the biblical author has a hard time fitting those critical elements into the new text, into the text that the biblical author is creating. He's essentially painting himself into a corner sometimes. So when we read a biblical text and a sentence sticks out to us, this may not be a redaction. This may actually be one of those critical elements that the biblical author is having a hard time fitting into the new narrative. And so I think that might be what's happening here. This about the dogs licking up the blood is that this is from the original oral tradition, and the biblical author is just not fitting it very well into the new narrative. But secondly, dogs don't actually eat Ahab or Naboth, right? They're licking up their blood. It doesn't necessarily. It's not really a curse of non-burial. It's right. If somebody gets killed and they bleed out there, and then the body is taken away and buried, the dogs can still lick up the blood where the body had laid. If the biblical author had wanted to change the figurative into the literal, he would have said something like, and the dogs ate the flesh of, the dogs will eat the flesh of you, or whatever. And that's exactly what we have when it comes to Jezebel. It says dogs will eat Jezebel inside the walls of Jezreel. And so I think those instances are actually a redaction, which I will talk about a little bit more later. But with Ahab, Ahab's blood presents a bit of a problem for the biblical author because remember, Ahab isn't from Samaria, and so the biblical author has to get Ahab's blood to Samaria. So how do you do that? Well, I think the solution is clever, if not contrived. But he simply has the Ahab bleed out in the chariot, and then the chariot is brought to the pool of Samaria, right? So this brings us to the next quote about blood, where Jehu says that just as I saw the blood of Naboth and his sons yesterday, I will pay you back in this field. And so the inquisitive Bible reader once again points out, hey, this doesn't fit very well. This conflicts with the biblical narrative. It doesn't make any sense. And so, this must be a redaction or coming from another tradition. And so this, again, I think is another quote from an oral tradition. And so I think altogether we have 3 quotes from the original oral tradition. And they are, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers, which Naboth said. And then we also have, in the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, the dogs will lick up your blood. And we have, just as I saw the blood of Naboth and his sons yesterday, I will repay you back in this field. So we have these three quotes, and 2 of them don't fit very well in the narrative, and one of them is manipulated by repeating it with 2 other quote variations that we talked about. So that's why I think these quotes kind of stick out and don't really fit into the narrative. So I think understanding the biblical text as propaganda helps us understand some of these quotes or passages that kind of just don't fit in the narrative very well. All right, so is there an anti-Jezebel redaction? This is something else that the inquisitive Bible reader talks about. He points out, there are some passages that it just doesn't fit very well into the narrative when it talks about Jezebel. And so I think, yes, I do agree. I think these are redactions, although I don't think it's in the same way that the inquisitive Bible reader understands it. So the inquisitive Bible reader understands this as part of narrative that is this redaction is trying to take the blame off Ahab and put it on Jezebel for the murder of Naboth. Whereas I think that shift has already taken place when the biblical author took the oral tradition and put it into his own narrative. I think that blame has already shifted. This Jezebel redaction has a different purpose. And one purpose of it is that Jezebel it makes Jezebel into a prophet killer, not a Naboth killer, right? So it talks about Jezebel trying to, or killing the prophets Yahweh, and then trying to kill Elijah as well. And so this redaction, it runs through a few different places in Kings. If you want to look those up, here are the references. But one of the other things it's also attempting to do is show that Elijah is not alone, right? Elijah says that he's all, there's no other prophets of Yahweh, but Obadiah, there really were prophets of Yahweh. It's just that Obadiah was hiding them in caves. And, there really were 7,000 worshipers of Yahweh. It's just that Yahweh has hidden them away. And then the other purpose is getting rid of the body of Jezebel. And I think it's because, if Jezebel was the queen of Israel, right, they were married to Ahab, then there would be some, sort of burial place for her. It wouldn't be the burial place of a prostitute, right? That's for sure. And so one of the things that this Jezebel redaction repeats is that the dogs will eat Jezebel inside the walls of Jezreel. So it's moving, it's shifting, right? That first layer of biblical narrative worked hard to get Ahab as well as Jezebel into Samaria, and now this redaction is trying to get Jezebel back into Jezreel. And so this brings us all the way back to the Naomis Vineyard narrative, where the Greek version differs from the Hebrew version in that it doesn't mention Jezreel. And so I think this shift back to Jezreel is a redaction by this Jezebel redactor. And this redactor also seems to not only get Jezebel out of Samaria and back into Jezreel, but also just get rid of the burial place altogether, right? It's just there's no significant burial place of Jezebel, not because she was a prostitute, but because the dogs ate her and there was no body to bury, right? According to this redactor. So he mentions that no one will bury her. And then again, it talks about, Jezebel's corpse will be like manure on the ground in the fields surrounding Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say that this is Jezebel. Again, the redactor trying to explain why there was no burial place for Jezebel. Okay, so one other thing that the inquisitive Bible reader points out is that there are some parallels between the stories of Naboth and Bathsheba. I have no issue with that, other than to say that the Bathsheba narrative is also propaganda. The historical narrative, David and Bathsheba were married, and it was Uriah that got her pregnant. So if you want to learn more about that, be sure to check out my blog post on that topic. And so the inquisitive Bible reader does a great job of understanding that the story that we've been given by the Bible about Jezebel is not the historical story, and so he looks to 1 Kings 16:31 to try to maybe there's some remnant of truth about Jezebel in this verse that we can take away to understand who Jezebel really was. But of course, when I look at this verse, I see the propaganda as well here too. So, married to Ahab, princess, daughter of a king. So this is all propaganda that ties in with the rest of the narrative. And I don't think we can look at this verse to find anything about Jezebel that is really factual. And so, even though I don't think Jezebel actually was involved in the murder of Naboth, she may have been involved in the murder of Ahab. So this isn't a very direct connection, but we can make a connection. So in the verse where it talks about King Ahab dying, that we have one of those prostitute references, and so this may be a reframing of Jezebel's involvement in Ahab's death somehow. So, did Jezebel kill Naboth? No, I don't think so. I think we've shown that the biblical author was trying to shift blame away from Ahab over to Jezebel. But do I think Jezebel was innocent? Probably not. If I had to bet on it, I'd say she was involved in some shenanigans somewhere in the narrative, that's for sure. All right, so to review here, I'll go through the different layers of the narrative. The first layer, which really it's not a textual layer, it's the oral tradition that the biblical author was taking. And is also, I think, the historical narrative as well, historically factual for the most part. Is that Ahab was, not a king. He was a military leader who lived in Jezreel. He sold out to the Arameans, murdered Naboth over a land dispute, and Jezebel was a prostitute who seems to have played a part in the death of Ahab somehow, right? And then we have the biblical author come along, and it changes. Ahab lives in Samaria. He is the king of Israel. He's married to Jezebel, and Jezebel murders Naboth. And then we have that Jezebel redaction, where Jezebel is made into a prophet killer. Elijah is not alone. Jezebel is moved back to Jezreel, and her burial location is removed from the story. All right, well, hey, Thanks for watching this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, or you can look me up on Twitter. I'm at Bible Recon, and feel free to let me know your thoughts. Thanks.